before even Shelley's Frankenstein, I don't know, you probably know of some texts, like, for example, Voltaire's Micromegas. So Voltaire wrote this text about encountering giants, on a planet around Sirius and on Saturn. And the giants basically play us up right there. They're the ultimate ideal of the Enlightenment, these aliens. And they make us look bad, because we're so dirty and so kind of retrograde. And I think that that's something which you still find. You find that, even in true UFO believers, you get that idea that these aliens are superiors. They're basically like angels. They are these gods, that are going to teach us spirituality and teach us all the science. And then you have the dystopian version, which definitely the Romantics kind of brought back with something like Frankenstein. And then you get this sense of like, no, this technique, this technical world is leading towards destruction. And so it's interesting to notice even today, you still have those two strands kind of playing, the alien as invader with these machines kind of coming and crushing us, and then the Star Trek type of utopia of the future.
Recently on my Metaverse video, I received a comment from a guy named Damien Walter, who has a channel all about the ins and outs of science fiction. I guess he's a science fiction writer. And then in my feed, I noticed that he had a discussion recently with Jonathan Pageau on Rebel Wisdom, and they were talking about science fiction and its place in society. And that was something that I had touched on briefly in my Metaverse video, specifically about how MCU has kind of become like a technological replacement for our past mythology. And as science fiction and fantasy blend together, we see how we look at the past in the through the eyes of technology, and Thor becomes this super advanced alien, and then you have the movie Eternals, which is really a sort of a retelling of the Enoch story. And one of the things you kind of see as you look at trends over history is that things never really go away. They just come back in new forms. And so the story of Enoch is really it's the Jewish version of this story that was popular in the Babylonian era, about these Apkallu that were these gods or demigods that came down, and they mated with women, and they produced these giants, and they were also the distributors of technology to the masses. And in the Babylonian story, they are the good guys because they bring power and influence and all this stuff. In the book of Enoch, they're really the bad guys because they are the ruiners of society that cause humans to become so sinful that God needs to destroy them in the flood. And so now, this is like the ancient aliens story, and Marvel's trying to kind of make it more modern for today. And in my opinion, this is all part of the rollout for the panspermia theory. Part of the so much of our current society is built on the back of Darwinian thinking, and those who are really not following it in a cult-like fashion, but the real scientists at the top of their game, and I'm not saying Christians, but real scientists, of some who may be Christians, but also secular scientists, have come to the point where they see that there's really insurmountable problems with the mechanism of Darwinian evolution, survival of the fittest, random mutations. And so there's going to be a need for a replacement, and especially when it comes to the basic starting point of the evolutionary theory, the abiogenesis, how life became from non-life. And Stephen Meyer has put forth that one of the theories that's gaining popularity is panspermia, which is the idea that extraterrestrials seeded our planet with life, either directly or indirectly through microorganisms or something that traveled through space on meteors, or like in the Prometheus story, the alien movie, that they came to Earth, and like that's how life began. And really, this is just an updated retelling of the Enoch story. But I also recently finished Tom Holland's book Dominion, and it was one of a bunch of these kind of stories that I've gone through where people want to start from ancient times and tell history in a linear fashion, going through all the different ages and epochs to express whatever point it is that they're trying to get across. And Tom Holland's spin on it is that he's showing how Christianity has been this ever-present catalyst for change throughout society. Francis Schaeffer's How Should We Then Live is one that I really like, and he is putting it very similarly in the Christian perspective, but analyzing different things and showing how that when people have strayed from the message of Christianity, that things kind of go awry. And then there's a lot of these other ones. In John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, he does a similar thing, going through a lot of the philosophical and religious thoughts, starting all the way back, even further back than some of the other ones do in ancient Greece. And then Ben Shapiro wrote one as well, and he was really trying to advocate not necessarily the purely Christian, but the mix of the ancient Greek, Neoplatonism, and Christianity, and that he put it as Athens and Jerusalem. Those are the pillars of our society. And in Schaeffer's version, he kind of put the Protestant Reformation as one of the high points. And, he kind of complained a lot about, I would say complained. He gave due credit to the influence of Thomas Aquinas. But he said that the problem with Aquinas is that Aquinas did not believe that the intellect of man was fallen. And so he started a line of thinking, which as philosophers continue to follow, caused real problems. And for those who reject the notion that Christ is Lord, and that the Bible is the foundation for a lot of this wisdom, the time that they look back on as the golden era is the Enlightenment. That's in like Steven Pinker's book, and a lot of the new atheists, I think, probably look at this Enlightenment period as this was the golden age. This is when our society really got its start. And as I was reading Dominion, there were some things that stuck out to me about the Enlightenment passage. And most of these stories, when they talk about the Enlightenment, there's many figures that'll come up, but some of the key ones that are mentioned in both these books, and also in Eric Metaxas' book, Is Atheism Dead?, which I read recently. And he does a similar thing, going through the history of philosophy and thought. And a couple of characters pop up every time you mention the Enlightenment. These are the real key figures. One of them is Voltaire, and the other is the Marquis de Sade. And as I was reading Tom Holland's book, it was very interesting because, the Enlightenment here it's 100 years before Darwin, and the Marquis de Sade is echoing some of the thoughts that Darwinism produced. And I would say, really, his thoughts are more an echo of the thoughts that are put forth by Thomas Huxley at the same time as Darwin. We'll be gracious to Darwin. He wanted to be a scientist, and he wanted to be appreciated for his scientific work. That was his main thrust. But Thomas Huxley is really the one that saw the implications of the Darwinian theory and what they could do in giving man an excuse to divorce society from the fetters of religion, and he went full speed with that. But the ideas, and perhaps some of his inspiration, go back even farther. And so here's a couple of quotes from Dominion that stood out to me, talking about the Marquis de Sade. The true division in society lay not between friends and enemies of the people, but between those who were naturally masters and those who were naturally slaves. Only when this was appreciated and acted upon would the taint of Christianity finally be eradicated and humanity live as nature prescribed. The inferior class of man, so a philosophy in The New Justine coolly observed, is simply the species that stands next above the chimpanzee on the ladder, and the distance separating them is, if anything, less than that between him and the individual belonging to the superior caste. So, the idea of identifying with the ape is there. Whereas now, you have people like the rationality rules guy, taking as a badge of honor to identify themselves as an ape. Marquis de Sade, and I believe you could easily say the same for Henry Huxley, saw this sort of an idea as a good and legitimate reason why they could put themselves in a superior position and denigrate the men that they consider to be lower. Obviously, this led to all kinds of racism, and this was a lot of the philosophical justification for slavery and segregation and the misuse and mistreatment of Africans and other ethnicities that were not white Europeans. And then, he had another little quote speaking about it, specifically in regard to the slaves, where it said, English plantation owners in the Caribbean, masters of life and death over their human chattels as they were among the few contemporaries worthy to be compared to the ancients. Wolves eating lambs, lambs devoured by wolves, the strong killing the weak falling victim to the strong. Such is nature, such are her designs, such is her plan. And again, this is the Marquis de Sade. The English, like the Spartans or the Romans, understood this. It is why, Sade wrote, they were in the habit of chopping up their slaves and boiling them in vats, or else crushing them in the cane mills, as slow a way to die as it is dreadful. There was only the one timeless language, the language of power. So, when we look at something like the progression, that start from Darwin to Marx to Lenin, and then now the postmodernist critique that everything is about power. These ideas are not really new. They were articulated 100 years before Darwin by the Marquis de Sade, who's probably about one of the most despicable people you could ever learn about. And so that is the attitude. The attitude that some are greater than others, and some would say this is the problem with our technocratic elites of today, that they really feel this way. There's no doubt that the Bezos and Zuckerbergs of the world and the Bill Gates look with disdain upon the common man. But it's not just enough to have that thought. You need to have the vehicle to do it. And the vehicle to do it is technology. And this is where the Enoch story comes in. And as Jonathan Pageau and Damian Walter were having this conversation, Damien Walter brought up Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as the first example of science fiction, one of the first. And this is the thing, this is the dissecting power of Darwinism, in that you can break everything down into its constituent parts and into the tiniest pieces and little pieces, and then every time you break it apart, you don't find any angels or demons or spirits, you just find more and more matter. And so therefore, conceivably, we can take the matter, cut it into smaller pieces, rearrange it, reorganize it, reconstruct it, and a new kind of man can be made, a Frankenstein monster. But Jonathan Pageau brought up a story that I had not been aware of by Voltaire, the other pillar of the Enlightenment, the other name that's brought up in all these books as a catalyst to this figure. And Voltaire, as Tom Holland puts it in his book, he was disdainful of the fact that because he was born and baptized into a privileged position in French society as a Catholic, he had all this freedom and he could do whatever he wanted, but it didn't matter at all that he did not actually care about God or believe in God, which, was absurd. And he realized that it was absurd. And it was an abuse of the fact that Catholic teaching had tied itself to the state, and it was so integrated into French culture that you couldn't separate the two. And he wrote this story that Jonathan Pageau referenced called Micromegas, and it's a kind of a funny satirical story, but it's about this traveler from a distant world who's a giant, because he comes from, I guess, what they thought was the planet of the star Sirius, and he's like thousands and thousands of feet tall. And then he visits this other, he's visiting around the solar system, and he visits the planet Saturn and meets this other guy there who's, to him, tiny, but is still like 9,000 feet tall or something. And then they both come to Earth, and they don't appear to see any life because they're so giant that they can't even see people. But eventually they pick up this little boat full of philosophers, and they're talking to the people on there, and he's just poking fun at all of these absurd philosophers. And he's kind of a equal opportunity offender, I guess, in the way that he makes fun of everybody. But it seems like clearly the person that he thinks is the most absurd is Thomas Aquinas and his followers. But I just thought it was really interesting that although it's satirical and he's not saying this is the way it is, he's still using the fact that now that we have learned so much about astronomy and we can tell the size and the scope of our universe a little bit more, the solar system, we can see how much bigger a planet like Saturn is than Earth, and therefore the people there must be equally greater than us in size, and a star like Sirius, I guess they thought it was a planet, it's even bigger, so therefore there must be even bigger people there. And he's basically using the idea of the scale of the universe that we live in as a technological device to discredit the human idea that there is something special about humanity and that man has unique attributes and that there is something special about mankind. And the thing that struck me first of all is just the idea of giants, and that they would be bringers of superior knowledge and intellect, and that their arrival would signal, in some sense, a change in the status of man, as man is no longer going to be the dominant force in the universe because he is now aware of these greater beings. And so it's just interesting that as we learn these things, the terms change. And so, what maybe would have been angels and demons and archons and things like that, they change and morph into aliens and extraterrestrials. But the story is the same. And it's still about appealing to an authority that's not the absurd God that people like Voltaire and Marquis de Sade disdain, but it's a technological breakthrough that allows them to have this power and seize this power and be able to start this enlightenment, and we want to think of that as this great thing that light was brought. But the bringer of light in the Latin is Lucifer. He's the devil. And in that way, the Enlightenment is clearly another age like that of the book of First Enoch. It's another time where these spirits are coming and usurping man's place and bringing technology and advancement. And the point is not to glorify God, but to tear down the church and tear down everything that God's built. And that's what they're wanting to do. And of course, the most prevalent technological advancement that the Enlightenment was known for was the guillotine. And, that's the thing that, whether you want to say it didn't happen physically, but metaphorically, the demons came and they gave birth to the giants, and the giants devoured all the people. And so I think that, we can see that these stories really, they don't ever really go away. And we'll look at the details and we say, oh, angels, that's absurd. But aliens, now that's something else. And that's the trick that they do with these sort of things. So that was just kind of a little bit of my observation of these things, and I'm kind of just going through all these different things, and I'm filling in the empty spaces in my map, and one aspect to think of is just the fact of, if the Bible speaks of a supernatural evil intelligence, it's not something that's going to manifest itself in a physical form, because that's not what it's able to do. But it is able to communicate to people. And so the main weapon of these sort of demons is going to be ideas. And the Enlightenment was an event that was sparked by ideas being put forth. And that is the sort of technology that these spirits bring. And then, not that it's all for ill, because the church comes alongside and the church struggles with this stuff and they figure it out, and it gets real messy and bloody sometimes. But then they're able to sanctify it and redeem it. And then you have good things come out of it. Whereas it's not always the French Revolution, sometimes it's the American Revolution. Not that America is perfect, but it was a better revolution than the French Revolution, for sure. And the freedoms that it brought were of benefit to everybody. It wasn't restrictive like the Catholic system that the Enlightenment came to overthrow, or that the murderous regime that followed it. So, yeah, I'm just trying to fill in the map, and it's just interesting to see how these threads they come back over time, and so I think that's something we need to be thinking about and aware of as we approach our society and we look at the sort of fictional stories that we're telling now. Because even though they seem silly on the surface, something like Voltaire's Micromegas is a silly kind of story. Sometimes the things that make us laugh does a good job of just causing us to not think seriously about something that we should be thinking seriously about. So that's about all I have for tonight.